Thank you for making it today, and for your interest in this topic. I'm going to get my slides up in a minute, but actually, let me just do that right away. Hopefully you can see them. So yes, I'll be talking for about half an hour about the book. And then we'll have a chance to maybe reflect a little bit on the lessons or the ways in which this work, this research might be applicable in the UK context, and particularly when it comes to schools. I've done versions of this talk which were more academic, so today I'm very sort of deliberately trying to make this a little bit less abstract, a little bit more practical, but I might still slip into the academic language. So if there's anything that sounds confusing or that you would like me to say a bit more about, feel free to say so in the chat, or also in the questions afterwards. But hopefully there won't be. I've sort of really tried to focus less on the theoretical side in this. As Charlotte has already mentioned, today's talk is about this new book, Educating for the Anthropocene, Schooling and Activism in the Face of Slow Violence. And I'm going to explain what I mean by some of those expressions in the title and in the subtitle in a minute. But one thing I would like to just draw your attention to from the get-go is that if you are interested in this work, you don't have to buy the book. It's freely available online, open access, and we'll be sharing the link to it in the chat. So you're welcome to go and read it. There are sort of different chapters, different sections. You can either read the whole thing or you can read the sections that seem the most relevant to you. But it's all out there free for people to use. So just wanted to make sure that I say that before I forget. So let me start with the word Anthropocene, which a lot of people have come across. Some people may not have. Different people use it differently. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about the Anthropocene and the way that I use it. It is a term that originates in geology, and it's basically referring to a new geological era that has, according to some scientists, according to some geologists, already started. And as the name might suggest, Anthropocene, anthropos, it's about humans. It's got to do with human influence on the natural environment. So many of us, would have heard of the Holocene as the current geological period, which began when at the end of the last ice age, sort of roughly 12,000 years ago. The idea of the Anthropocene is that Holocene now has ended and we have this new era. I'm sort of looking at this image, that I'm sharing with you, and I always sort of get struck, when I look at this, at just the sheer timescales of geological time and the kind of deep time that we are sort of entering when we start using a word like the Anthropocene, time that goes well beyond an individual lifespan. And when you think about some of the events that marked an end or a beginning of a geological epoch or a geological era before, some of them were very significant, such as the asteroid that we believe fell on Earth 65 million years ago and led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. So if you think about that kind of comparison, essentially the idea of the Anthropocene is that we humans have become the asteroid, that we have that kind of power, that kind of influence over the planet. But it is also important to keep in mind some of the limitations of this word. This is a quote that I include in the book's introduction. This explanation might be sufficient for polar bears or orangutans seeking to understand what species was disturbing their habitat. Essentially what this is talking about is the idea that, if you were a polar bear and you wanted to know why your habitat is changing, then the Anthropocene, could seem like a sufficient explanation. There's this other species, human beings, and they are doing something which is changing your habitat. But if you want to go beyond that level of understanding, then I suppose you have to acknowledge that not all people are equally responsible, and that we can't just sort of put everybody into the same box and claim that all human beings, as a species, share responsibility for the kind of environmental change that is occurring. That's why scholars have come up with all kinds of alternatives. There is the Anglocene, which is basically recognizing the fact that English-speaking parts of the world have contributed disproportionately to things like climate change. There is the Capitalocene, which looks at the influence of capitalism. There is the Oliganthropocene, which looks at oligarchs. So there are all these sort of different ways that people have sort of tried to come up with an alternative. And yet in this book, even as I acknowledge those criticisms, I still use the word Anthropocene. And the reason for that is that I think the word has a bit of a shock value, and I think we need that. If we are to maybe think of different ways of approaching education, we need something that sort of allows us to maybe shake ourselves a little bit out of the some of the notions that we currently have about education. But also I think it is, to my mind, helping us maybe come up with an alternative to something like 21st century education. So I do quite a lot in the book with comparing this idea of educating for the Anthropocene with the idea of education for the 21st century skills and so on, which have been around for quite a long time. But, when you think about them, I think, certainly when I think about them, what I sort of come away with is that over time, they've become really diluted and they've sort of lost a lot of their original meaning. So, for example, critical thinking is a 21st century skill that we hear about a lot. But, in this book, I refer to critical thinking as simply just problem solving for infinite growth. That it's basically, infinite thinking only up to a point, only up to a degree, sort of remaining within the parameters of the kind of current extractivist system that we are all part of. So to my mind, that's not really what some of the people who are thinking about critical thinking when they first coined that term necessarily meant. And so I think with 21st century skills and 21st century education, we just have to be careful about sort of recognizing how maybe over time that agenda has changed, and how perhaps it has become commodified, and how maybe it really ultimately serves the labor market, and the kinds of skills that the workers that the companies, the corporations that are hiring are expecting young people to have, rather than the kind of educational goals that some of these were meant to accomplish. And so that's where I sort of try to use the Anthropocene as an alternative, because it refers, just like the 21st century, to the current historical moment. But it sort of destabilizes that idea of the 21st century. It sort of tries to almost show that marker, between the 20th and the 21st century is very, very insignificant when compared to the marker between the Holocene and the Anthropocene. So I think, all of this is just to say that this is a word that I think has a lot of value when we think about education. At the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind, all of those criticisms and the issues that different people have identified with this term. Okay, so now let me tell you a bit more about the book itself. So the book is an ethnography, which means that it's a book of stories, right? Ethnography is basically a way of doing research where the researcher goes into a place, spends a lot of time, tries to immerse in the community, immerse in the culture, immerse in what is happening, and to try and make sense of it. So this is a book which is my attempt to make sense of sort of roughly 4 years of research in South Africa and India. It is a book of stories. It's got a lot of characters. It is in places quite theoretical, but in other places it is really more of a almost written like a novel, right? It's sort of alternating between these two ways of writing and thinking about the world. You might recall in the subtitle, I use the expression slow violence, which is an expression that has been around for about 10 years. It was first used by a scholar by the name of Rob Nixon, who wrote a book called Slow Violence, which I would highly recommend to anybody who's interested in this. And his idea basically is that all of the kind of environmental decay, environmental change that is occurring, maybe not all of it, but certainly a lot of it, is occurring very slowly in ways that are very difficult to perceive with our human senses. And therefore, it is very different from what he would call the sort of fast violence of everyday news, the kind of violence that we can capture with our senses, with cameras, with lenses. Slow violence we cannot do that with, right? So that makes it a particularly difficult sort of challenge for educators. How do you educate somebody about something which might be violent, right? The kind of damage that is occurring to the planet might be violent, but it becomes difficult to perceive it. So in this book, the way I try to tackle this problem is through the choice of the places where I went to do this research. They're very specific communities that I picked for this work. And I refer to them in the book as examples of what I call the high Anthropocene. So not just the Anthropocene, which is what arguably all of us are already living in, but high Anthropocene, which basically means that these are places where a lot of the environmental damage and a lot of the kinds of things that define the Anthropocene are speeding up. They are no longer slow violence. They are accelerating violence. They are manifesting themselves in ways that people who live in these places actually can viscerally feel with their senses. And so that's the reason for the choice of these two particular places. And I think it'll become quite apparent, why, or sort of what I mean by that when I tell you a little bit about these places. But because these places are suffering so much environmentally, there are activists, there are people within the communities where I did this research who are challenging the kind of dominant narratives of the future. And that's why there's this central tension in this book between schooling and activism. What is going on in schools? What is going on in activist communities? And in what ways are young people making sense of that tension? That is a sort of a central question, a central concern of the book. And also because of this presence of activists, the book tries to sort of suggest that maybe we don't necessarily have to think of such quote unquote troubled places just as places of intervention, that are in need of some kind of external help or external support, but that they can actually be places of inspiration, that there's something to be learned from what is happening in these places that might help us think differently about education in some of the quote unquote less troubled places as well. And I think this is maybe where the question of, what can be learned from some of these examples for, say, the UK context could be quite interesting. And I think ultimately the book also tries to get at this kind of a paradox that we see in much of the kind of conversation about education and the environment, where we are expecting education to become some kind of a tool that is going to help us achieve a more sustainable future, and yet that education is in most cases controlled by governments that themselves are not doing anywhere enough to really make sure that future is possible, that more sustainable future is possible. And so, how can we expect formal education, schooling in a way, if that is how it is controlled, if that is how it is designed, how can we really expect it to undermine these governments by teaching young people to think in ways that go against maybe what some of these governments are doing? Is that a realistic goal? And therefore, do we need to look into these alternative spaces of learning, such as activism? So these are the sort of central themes. Now let me tell you more of the story of the book. So what you're looking at here is Tehri Dam, which is a massive dam in northern India, in the state of Uttarakhand. The biggest dam that the Indian government has built so far this century, which displaced about 100,000 people, and has been very, very controversial, not just because of the displacement, but also because it sits on a geological fault line. So in the case of an earthquake, there would be massive flooding, with likely hundreds of thousands of people flooded pretty much instantly. But also the sort of environmental consequences of it have been questioned beyond those kinds of worst case scenarios, because it is in the sort of foothills of the Himalayas. It's actually submerged lots and lots of trees, forests that basically are continuing to essentially rot underwater and releasing amounts of carbon that are by some estimates actually much greater than any electricity generation from hydropower that might be reducing carbon elsewhere, right? If that electricity was generated through coal or other sort of fossil fuel driven electricity generation. So very controversial project all around. And the research site where I did this work in India is called Pashulok, which is near the dam, and it is one of the rehabilitation sites for some of the people who were forcibly moved when the dam was built. Here you can see one of the streets in Pashulok. The government did very little to actually try and rebuild what was lost. It essentially just sort of dumped people in the middle of a field. No streets were built. No infrastructure. Very little infrastructure was created. This is a picture of an abandoned shopping center that the school where I did part of this research was essentially squatting on the sort of first floor. So there was no school building that was provided by the government. And as a result, both of that kind of neglect, but also that initial injustice of essentially forcibly moving these 100,000 people without really consulting them, there is a very strong presence of anti-dam activism. And also, within that sort of activist tradition, there's a very sort of deep questioning of the entire sort of model of development that India has been pursuing since it became independent from Britain, which has been essentially trying to emulate sort of Western way of development through large-scale infrastructure, through also very heavy industrialization. So there's a questioning that goes on, I think, in this community about whether that path really was the right path. What you're looking at here is the view from one of the school corridors in the school in South Africa, where I also worked when I was doing this research. You can see these smokestacks in the background, pretty much just a sort of a stone's throw away from the school. This is in a place called South Durban. So Durban is the third biggest city in South Africa after Cape Town and Johannesburg. And it is a place also with very, very troubled history. It is where some historians argue apartheid actually originated, because what you have here is the largest port in all of Africa. Lots and lots of shipping here, going all the way back to the 19th century. And because of that port being built here over time, there were lots and lots of industries that were built in the vicinity of the port. And, especially sort of in the late 19th, early 20th century, a lot of that industrialization was very, very dirty. There were very sort of poor environmental standards, which meant that it was difficult to attract workers who would be willing to work in these conditions. So the government essentially decided to, again, forcibly move people, and they were people of color, right, as opposed to white South Africans, to basically create sort of labor reserves of essentially disposable people who could be working in these factories. And this has created a situation where now, sort of fast forward to 2022, you've got residential communities in the immediate vicinity of these industries, which has major public health implications. In this particular school where I worked, about 55% of students were suffering from asthma. If you go sort of 4 or 5 miles north to the other side of the city, just over the hill, that number drops to about 5%. And it's similar with thyroid cancer and lots of other conditions that are linked to air pollution. So this is a major hotspot, not just for industrial pollution, but also for environmental racism, because obviously this affects groups, populations of color disproportionately. And because of this, again, you've got a very strong, very long history of activism, of challenging this environmental racism. And when I came to these places, the way I went about trying to understand, how young people in these, so what I call these spaces of the high Anthropocene, right? To go back to that slow violence metaphor, places where the slow violence accelerates, where it becomes visible. It starts affecting people's everyday lives in very tangible ways. How do young people in these places make sense of that place, or of that condition that they're dealing with? The sort of first thing that I did was just a lot of kind of visual expressions. I worked with kids in these schools, trying to understand how they were thinking about the future and about the past. I asked them to make drawings, about what they thought the future might look like in 100 years time. So this is what one 12-year-old boy from South Durban thought the future might look like in 100 years, which I think doesn't need much of a commentary. Here's another one, which is maybe a bit more schematic, but again pretty grim. And then when you looked at the pictures of the past, they were much more sort of happy pictures, with these sort of natural elements in the landscape that you can suddenly see a much kind of closer connection between humans and these natural elements. So in a way, if I just sort of stayed with this at this kind of level of understanding, I suppose I could have just sort of concluded that these young people are thinking about the future in very pessimistic terms, and about the past in much more optimistic terms. And that could have been my conclusion. But the beauty of ethnography as a way of doing research is that you get to spend a long time in a place, and you get to go beyond these initial impressions. And that is what I try to do in these places, by doing film projects with students, doing sort of observational documentary film, where I brought some equipment with me, and I showed the young people how to use it, and then they would just sort of go out and film, whatever they were interested in. And then they would bring the footage back, and we would look at it together and talk about why they chose to film certain things, how they were putting these films together. And that became a really sort of fruitful conversation, because again, it was happening over many months, which meant that trust was built, and it became possible to go beyond that just kind of a snapshot of the pessimistic future and the optimistic past. And one of the things that really struck me about all the films that the children made was that they were very interested in speaking to older people in their communities, and those older people were the activists. They were the ones who were, in the case of the Indian school or the Indian community, questioning the dam and the wisdom of the kind of model of development that the dam represented. And in the case of the South African community, really thinking about environmental racism and industrial pollution. So here you have one of the students, talking to the elders in the community about what life was like before the dam was built. Really trying to make sense of that, trying to understand that. This is from one of the films that was made in South Africa, where the person you're looking at is one of the activists holding a device to basically measure air quality, talking to the students about the ways that the activists are trying to hold the government accountable for regulating the industries in the area properly. So what I learned from these films and from the conversations that I had with the students was that there was a sense that the future could be different, right? That the future wasn't predetermined, and that this presence of activism and these alternative ways of thinking about the world were very much factoring in the children's thinking and imagination of what the future might eventually become, which led me to ultimately sort of ask myself, whether the schools were maybe not the best places actually to have those conversations, and whether maybe that activist presence, that the kind of learning, informal learning that was going on in the communities, maybe actually was a better way to educate somebody for the Anthropocene, right? To face up to this challenge of environmental decay and slow violence. So in the book, I end up making a few sort of different points, different arguments. One of which is that we should maybe separate out education from schooling, and not think of schooling as the only space in which education happens, and to recognize that there are these other spaces which can be very, very important, particularly when it comes to these issues of the environment. But also in thinking about formal education and schooling, I think a lot of the things that I learned from the children and that I learned from the activists, but also from some of the teachers in the schools where I worked, who were thinking of themselves as activist teachers, or sort of having that kind of a hybrid identity, straddling both worlds of formal education and activism. Was that in many ways what is currently happening in the sort of education policy landscape maybe goes against what some of these people were calling for. We see that curricula are not getting localized; they're getting globalized, right? We're sort of ending up with a lot of generic curricula that are sort of devoid of context. But a lot of what these activists are talking about has to do with that context, with the history of the place. So how do you do that, in a curriculum that is that lacks the kind of the kind of localization? And that's also linked to the role of the teacher. I think, when the curriculum becomes so generic, it becomes quite easy to start thinking of the teacher as simply somebody who is there to deliver this content, rather than actually have some agency themselves, and perhaps model this idea of imagining alternative futures for the young people that they are teaching. So I think, again, in many ways, I think the current trends in education policy tend to be away from that kind of a role of the teacher. But in the book, I also call for removing barriers between activists and educators. I have found in the course of doing this research that, at least in the places where I was working, there was a lot of skepticism, about the other group. So, when you talk to teachers, they would tell you that the activists are just, way too crazy and too sort of out there. And then when you talk to the activists, they would tell you the teachers are part of the problem. But again, I found that actually there were people who were both. They were both teachers and they were activists. So I think there's something to be learned in terms of looking for inspiration in you know these kinds of approaches to you know, kind of bridging education with activism. Okay, I'm almost done. You know, so what does the book ultimately say about, you know, what educating for the Anthropocene might mean? Well, first of all, it's about recognizing the moment, you know, that we're living in, not as 21st century, but as the Anthropocene, which means thinking in the context of deep time. So not just the kind of shallow, you know, everyday time that we inhabit, but you know the time scales of the planet, which inevitably forces us to think about planetary boundaries and stewardship of the planet. And it also means returning to a more radical definition of sustainability. I think when you look at what people who were using that term in the early days, you know, where the early days of sort of environmentalism, what they meant by it was environmental sustainability. Whereas nowadays we are told by, say, the United Nations in for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, that there are these three dimensions to sustainability: environmental, economic, and social, and these are somehow compatible. That, you know, somehow we can keep having infinite growth, we can keep growing the economy infinitely extracting from the environment, and at the same time have environmental sustainability. So to me, there seems to be a contradiction there, but somehow we don't talk about that contradiction very much. Now, before I finish, I'd just like to share a couple of images that are the result of a collaboration with a friend of mine who's a designer, where we sort of sat down and we thought about, you know, how do we take some of the ideas of this book and sort of present them in the sort of simplest way possible. And you know, we were particularly thinking about you know, teachers, you know, who are busy, who don't necessarily have the time to go and read an academic book. How do we kind of boil it down, you know, to something quite quick, you know, that we can share. So I will appreciate your feedback as to whether this is a good way to do it. But basically what we did was come up with these four words: grasp, care, imagine, and communicate. You know, grasping what is at stake; care, which is an emotional sort of response to something that we have grasped. And again, I think a lot of our current ways of thinking about education, say the 21st century education idea, are much more at the level of rational thinking than emotional responses. So I think paying attention to emotions, imagining, you know, that emotional response, fueling an imagination of an alternative future, and being able to communicate that to other people, and you know, out of that communication, you know, action that emerges, right? That emerges from different people coming together, sharing their visions of the future. And maybe the very last thing I would say about this this sort of model or this way of thinking about education is that, you know, we very deliberately picked language. We picked words that you know, refer to sort of innate ways of being human. So I think, you know, when a child is born, right, like, you know, a baby starts grasping. It's a very human thing to grasp, as it is to care, imagine, and communicate. I mean, these are things that we do as humans. And you know, so this idea of educating for the Anthropocene is nothing more than just simply trying to reconnect with some of these things and removing some of the barriers that might be getting in the way of being human in these particular ways. You know, rather than trying to sort of come up with any kind of fancy new concepts or ideas. You know, in some ways, we're really just sort of calling for a return to the basics. Okay, I'll stop there.
Lovely, thank you, Peter. Well, we're about to wrap up, but just before we do, we thought we'd share a couple of ways that Global Action Plan are putting some of your principles into practice, very much influenced by your thinking, and just to pick up on those points of kind of how you do bring youth activism into the classroom despite the system that we're in. So Ben is just going to take a couple of minutes to talk those through, and then we're going to close. Over to you, Bina.
Thanks, and thank you, Peter. That was really interesting. And I just wanted to sort of pick up a couple of things that were said through comments and through what you were saying, Peter, around, I guess, first of all, the sort of going back to that diagram of of grasping, then really being inspired by something and then being able to communicate, and that leading to action. And one of the programs that we run at Global Action Plan is the Dirt is Good program, which some of you may have heard about, or some of you might not have. But I just sort of wanted to share something that we've been working on more recently this term. So through Transform Our World, we have staff members that go into schools across England and deliver that programme. And we sort of work out what's working, what's not, with teachers, young people, etc. But the sort of thing that I wanted to link to was actually that this term we've actually got young people to start telling their own stories. And that has really not only sort of provided inspiration to other young people, but it's made it much easier to communicate to teachers and also hopefully parents through the way that we're capturing these change makers and this agency that young people have to make change in their schools, which is a really different way of working. We haven't done that before. We've got young people physically taking cameras, video recording each other, interviewing each other, really capturing the skills that they're developing, and the work that they're doing from their perspective, as well as the staff that are going in to support their development through this project. But I thought that's a really interesting way of sort of thinking about education in a different way as well, of actually it's young people leading their education as educators themselves in capturing all of that. So I'll put some links in the chat, but I thought, yeah, that's just something really interesting to share, and it'd be great to hear from other people if they're doing similar stuff like that in the future to contact us, because it's a new way of thinking that we've got around this sort of space. And then also just to touch on what Jenny was saying about power, and we've just run a youth summit for 2 weeks, all talking about power, because it's not spoken about in school. It's something that's sort of shied away from because it's quite a difficult topic to talk around, and a lot of this stuff is very politicized and is very difficult for teachers to talk about, especially in sort of a curriculum that's very constrained. But we work with a group of youth ambassadors who are between the ages of 12 and 16. And they were actually, the main sort of feedback that they gave to us was around sort of they don't understand their own agency, they can't feel their own power, they're against everything, and they have nothing to sort of target or tackle that. And we've supported and worked with them over the sort of last 3 or 4 months, and they've actually been designing a campaign to call for more equal environmental education, because they feel it themselves. They have lots of different levels of eco-education, and eco-education itself isn't fulfilling for them in their schools and what they want in order to feel like they have that agency as young people to call and make change. So again, I'll put some links in the chat, but that might be another really interesting thing to have a look at if you haven't already. And if you like it, please share. They've designed a petition to call for that change, and if you agree with it, please sign and share it. But most importantly, yeah, just great to share it with everyone and to get your perspective as well, and do get in touch if there's sort of things that are of interest or you have any questions around it. But thank you so much for coming this evening. It's been really interesting. I hope it's been really helpful to everyone and interesting to everyone listening, and this will be recorded and we'll have it available on Transform Our World, so you can rewatch it or share it with others if they're unable to attend. But yeah, thanks.
Wonderful, thanks Bina. And thanks for all your contributions, everybody, and for joining us tonight. It's been brilliant having this discussion. And obviously, huge thanks to Peter for so generously sharing the content of your book with us all. Fascinating to hear it articulated by you, and, you know, those stories that you told us, you know, if anything could demonstrate the power of storytelling, they really do.